gentlemen, we would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the NICE Global Conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The Institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
But thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is connecting Nepal to the world by bringing in leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of this conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time, the Nepalese policymakers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal to reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goals. This is the session 13 of the conference. The session that we're going to have is on US foreign policy under Biden administration. And to chair and moderate the session, it is a real pleasure to have Ambassador Dr. Arjun Karki. Ambassador Karki served as an ambassador of Nepal to the United States from 2015 to 2021. As the residential ambassador of Nepal to the US, he has also served as the non-residential ambassador to Panama, Costa Rica, Mexico, El Salvador, and Honduras. He has been the president of the Rural Reconstruction Nepal since 1989, and the international coordinator of LDC was since 2004. In 2011, he was awarded the Justice and Peace Award by the Bishop Haksun Justice and Peace Foundation based in South Korea for his contribution for protection of human rights and the development of impoverished and marginalized communities in Nepal. He has been continuously working in diplomacy, research, and Nepalese foreign affairs even after his retirement. So without any further ado, I would request the chair to take over.
Okay. Thank you, Jaiswalji. Namaste. Hello and welcome, distinguished panelists, honored participants, and NICE officials from all over the world to this seminar on US foreign policy under Biden administration. As a part of the Global Conclave 2021, I would like to thank NICE for organizing this event. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct honor and pleasure to be moderating today's panel. I come from a policy advocacy and development background, and I had the honor of serving as the Nepal's ambassador to the United States for almost 6 years. And my service came to a close in January of 2021. My term of service spanned from the Obama to the Biden administration. In fact, I also had the honor of attending President Biden's and Vice President Harris' inauguration a few weeks before my time as ambassador was to end. Distinguished panelists and participants, you are all aware of the impact that US foreign policy has on politics, security, and economics across the world. Indeed, that is why we are here today as diplomat, scholar, expert to share our observation on how current US foreign policy is going to impact us and our region. This is a brilliant opportunity for us to bring our knowledge and opinion to the table. The Biden administration interim national security strategic guidance on US national security and foreign policy published in March 2021 begins by stating that our world today is at an inflection point and that global dynamics have indeed seen a shift. I quote a section of report: new crises demand our attention, and in this moment of accelerating global challenges, from pandemic to the climate crisis, to nuclear proliferation, to the fourth industrial revolution, the themes explored in the interim strategic guidance in many ways precedes the policy of the previous administration and their impacts on US foreign policy and international relations. Whether we talk about new waves of democracy movement that began in the early 2000s, that we call the Arab Spring, or the absolutely pressing nature of the world climate crisis, US foreign policy set by the current administration is about more than diverging from their predecessors. The rallying point, according to them, is the revitalization of the American democracy. The US is a global power with the track record and ability to project this power militarily, economically, and politically. Such influence is built rather than obtained. In fact, the Biden administration has explicitly stated that the motivation behind investing in their leadership role in the world as a democracy is driven by self-interest, so that Americans can live in peace, security, and prosperity. There is an important lesson we can learn here, that the interest of others can also be viewed through the lens of self-interest. Investing in others is not divesting from the self. And in today's world, where our most pressing and devastating issues are one that have not been contained within political borders. This is an important sentiment for us to have. Likewise, talking about US foreign policy, Secretary of State Blinken argues that the enduring principle of US foreign policy is that we need countries to cooperate now more than ever. Not a single global challenge that affects our life can be met by any one nation acting alone, not even one as powerful as United States. It is much about taking the hand as it is about extending it. This afternoon, we are conducting this panel as an open space for dialogue, and I fully expect and encourage a diversity of opinion and critique that will empower us to press out our comfort zone and give us the courage to engage in dialogue that promotes accountability amongst ourselves and global powers that have so much influence on our countries and region. Now, we will hear from our distinguished panel of speakers. Each panelist will have 7 to 8 minutes time to make your presentation. And at the end of the session, we will take questions from participants to make this dialogue interactive. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Peter Trubowitz, Professor of International Relations and Director of Phelan US Center at London School of Economics and Political Science and Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Dr. Trubowitz The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. It's good to be with you and everyone else on the platform today. I want to thank the NICE and the conference organizers for inviting me to participate in this roundtable about the Biden administration's foreign policy. And I thought what I would do with my 7 minutes is briefly identify what I think are Biden's foreign policy's distinguishing features, and then take a moment to discuss the challenges that he faces in making good on the course that he has set America on. Now, Biden's foreign policy is obviously a work in progress. The administration is just 6 months old, and much is still being worked through, including ambassadorial appointments. But already I think we can see 3 emerging themes or components to the administration's foreign policy, which we might call Biden's 3 Rs. These include repairing America's brand, its international brand. Secondly, realigning America's commitments and its power. And thirdly, reconnecting what America does abroad to the needs of working class voters at home. So repairing, realigning, and reconnecting, Biden's 3 Rs. When it comes to America's brand, Biden, I think, has lost little time reasserting the nation's traditional commitment to human rights and the rule of law. And this is sure to be a constant theme in the months ahead. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand why. 4 years of Donald Trump's indifference to human rights abroad and the flagrant abuse of the rule of law at home took a toll on the United States internationally. And Biden's commitment to repair America's brand is important in an attempt to reverse and to change that dynamic. It doesn't mean that we're going to see perfect consistency on matters having to do with human rights, or that democratic values will always trump geopolitical interest. Biden's meeting with Putin in Geneva earlier this month made that pretty clear, I think, if it wasn't already. The point is that under Biden, I think advocating human rights and the rule of law is once again considered a strategic resource in America's diplomatic toolbox and of intrinsic value in themselves. And so I think that we will see more and hear more about this in the months and the years ahead. Like most presidents, Biden took office with clear ideas about what parts of the world are most vital to US security and how heavily to invest in alliances to protect them. In Biden's case, 2 things are already, I think, pretty clear about his strategic priorities. First, he is focusing far greater attention on the strategic heartland of Eurasia than his predecessor. And secondly, that he hopes to do this in close coordination with America's traditional allies in Europe and in Asia, and to the extent possible, others such as India. Much of this effort, of course, is focused on China, with actions that range from reinvigorating the Quad to recommitting to Taiwan's security, to the recent NATO summit declaring China as a security risk, to the G7's agreement to launch a green alternative to China's Belt and Road program, to winding down America's military presence in Afghanistan. And I think the Pentagon's Global Force Posture Review, which is still in process, will almost certainly reinforce this direction of kind of strategic travel by the United States. So we've talked about repairing America's brand, realigning commitments and power, and how I think Biden is going to try to do this and is doing it. And that brings us to reconnecting to the middle class, the third component, I think, of Biden's strategy. Dean Acheson once said, there's no longer any difference between foreign questions and domestic questions. They're all part of the same question. He said that back in 1950. This was true in Acheson's day, and Biden has pledged to make it a cardinal principle of his foreign policy in his pledge to reconnect what America does abroad to the needs of working families at home. If this sounds a little bit like Donald Trump's America First, you're not mistaken. Though free of the xenophobia and the racism and the unilateralism that Trump's vision entailed, Biden has declared that he is not going to pursue foreign economic policies that serve the needs of the few at the expense of the many. What this has meant concretely is putting multilateral trade agreements like TPP and TTIP on hold. It has meant strengthening Buy America provisions in federal procurement policies in the United States and proposing multi-trillion-dollar investments in domestic technology, in domestic infrastructure, and in sustainability. So these are the core features, I think, of Biden's emerging foreign policy. He's trying to repair America's image in the world. He's trying to refocus on America's traditional commitments in Eurasia, and he's trying to reconnect what America does abroad with the needs of people at home. What unites these three elements of Biden's foreign policy, I think, is a commitment to re-engage internationally, but in ways that play to America's comparative strategic advantages, its allies, its huge economy, and its somewhat tarnished values. Now, whether Biden can deliver on all of this, that is uncertain. In my view, the strategy rests on two big bets, one international, the other domestic. So let me briefly say a word about each by way of concluding. Biden's international bet is that he can regain the support of America's many allies in dealing with international challenges, and especially in dealing with China. And he has made a good deal of progress, I would say, on this front since taking office, most notably at the G7 and NATO meetings earlier this month. But there are challenges here. And one is simply that many of America's allies are not willing to sign up to another Cold War, with this one with China. A second is that America's allies wonder whether Biden is the new normal in the United States or just a kind of fleeting reprieve from Trump's America First. It's worth recalling that Trump won 74 million votes in a losing cause. This brings us to Biden's second bet, domestic politics. And Biden's ability to make good on his international agenda depends greatly on his ability to overcome the deep political division in Washington and beyond. And here I think the jury is very much out. Biden is working with very thin margins in Congress, which are likely to disappear with the midterm elections in 2022. So if Biden hopes to convince America's allies that the US is really back, as he says, he needs to show that his policies command support at home. Conversely, if he hopes to secure the support of Americans for his foreign policies, he needs to demonstrate that they are paying concrete economic dividends for average Americans. And this is Biden's challenge. The two things are interrelated, interconnected, and there's a lot riding on it and on his ability to meet it, and not just for the United States. And I'll leave it right there and turn the platform back to the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for highlighting the Biden's foreign policy and particularly emphasizing the 3R strategy of the President Biden: repairing, reconnecting, realigning, in other words, rebranding the United States. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, a former Indian diplomat who has served as ambassador and high commissioner to Canada and South Korea, a spokesperson for the Foreign Office, and whose posting was included the United States, Russia, China, Pakistan, Japan, and Egypt. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, a pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Karki. Greetings, Anyang Hashimika. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be with you all. And thank you, Dr. Peter. You have made my task that much easier because it so happens that broadly I agree with what your outlook and stance. Let me say at the outset, the US matters. The US matters. Developments and outlook of the US has an impact far beyond its borders. And I would also add that rarely in the history of the US has such an experienced political leader come to office, has occupied the White House. And as significantly, he has also put together with great speed and alacrity a very competent, cerebral and experienced team. We remember what had happened 4 years ago, so it makes all the difference. He is an old school gentleman politician, and he has been very quick from day one to spell out his outlook and priorities, both domestic and external. Clearly, there is so much that a leader has to attend to back home, so it is natural that he is giving a lot of emphasis to domestic affairs. And as Dr. Peter said, there is a thin line dividing domestic policies and external policies. One has an impact on the other. But on the external front, the message is very clear. Read my lips, America is back. And also there is a refreshing candor in that America cannot do it alone. America will lead not merely by example of power, but power of example. And I know that there is a bit of political rhetoric, but well, there is a refreshing change of tone, and especially from the uncertainty that had surrounded the US foreign policy outlook, if one can call it foreign policy in the 4 years, I think this is a refreshing change. I have also looked at it in a similar refrain as Dr. Peter does, but instead of calling it 4R, I discern a few distinct features which is stated by him and also borne out in practice. One, I think there is a sense of realism and realpolitik, which is clearly discernible. In his article that he had penned in April 2020, before he assumed office, then candidate Biden had said that by nearly every measure, the credibility and influence of the United States in the world has diminished. Certainly it has diminished, but it remains, as I said in my very opening remarks, a preeminent power. And not just militarily, but in innovation, in infotech. Yes, it is no longer the sole economic power. Secondly, it's also a fact that the 20-year war on terror has led to a huge drain in its resources, and that will have an impact on what the US does. And I'm here talking in the context of the security matrix, notwithstanding stated positions in the years ahead. The withdrawal from Afghanistan does not enhance American standing in the region and beyond. I do understand that after 20 years, it is difficult, but the impact that is there cannot be overlooked. It is realpolitik which led to the meeting between Putin and President Biden. It was, I think, handled very well. No leader, especially the US, wants a two-front situation. It was carefully choreographed, meticulously prepared. Expectations were systematically underplayed. And once cameras were off, they got down to brass tacks, it got down to business. It was diplomacy at its best, as I've written in my articles also. And also, I would dare say that most countries are willing to follow the American lead if America is willing to lead. And that there is, to that extent, there is a continuity. In his approach, there is also the traditionalism. Once again, there is reliance on diplomacy, peaceful talks, and persuasion in achieving foreign policy objectives, synergizing between friends and allies, Quad, G7, NATO, Putin. All these developments are an example of good old traditional politics as opposed to abrasiveness or dominance, squeezing the hand of the interlocutor into a pulp, and so on and so forth. And then I slightly diverge with Dr. Peter that there is, I would call it a ubiquitous rhetoric, the emphasis on human rights, freedom of speech, democracy. We believe in everything, all three of them. I mean, we are the largest democracy, and these are good ideals, but we all know that in real life, this is applied more as per political expediency and followed more in breach than observance. And with respect to the Trump administration, Biden administration is following a policy of continuity and change. Change in that he has undone a lot of things that was arbitrarily decided by his predecessor, including rejoining the Paris Accord, reassuring the allies of the American security commitments, re-engaging with NATO, and most importantly, reviving the JCPOA negotiations. He has adjusted America's relationship with Saudi Arabia. And then there is continuity where, to the credit of the Biden administration and the Secretary of State, they have recognized what change the Trump administration brought about. And here they are giving primacy to the Indo-Pacific region, to Quad. They have designated China as the most serious competitor. It is worth noting, I don't have the time to get into further detail, but they have not, unlike the Trump team, never called China an adversary, and therein hangs the tail. Very interestingly, President Biden has said, we are ready to work with Beijing when it is in America's interest to do so. I mean, I don't know of anybody who works with another country when it is not in its interest to do so. And then I mentioned already the speedy withdrawal from Afghanistan. And lastly, the investigation into the origin of COVID. Despite what has been said, I think I would dare say that something does not smell right. Close to 20 months have lapsed. The trail has gone cold. Now we know that even from the NIH database, at the request of China, there were important data which was deleted, unheard of. I've served in the US, follow the US. And we all know that there will not be a smoking gun. There will be only pointers and circumstantial evidence, which has been completely ignored. I say that with all sense of responsibility. How it will pan out is anybody's guess, but there are certain things which require answers which are elusive. Thank you very much. And thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Prakash. You have talked about US model of leadership, whether it is leadership by example of power or power leadership by power of example. We have covered the Indo-Pacific issue, Quad, China, and all. I would like to hear from you later more on, US foreign policy impact in our region, South Asia.
Happily.
But now I would like to invite Dr. Amit Gupta, Associate Professor at the Department of International Security Studies at the prestigious USAF who are College Alabama, among others. Dr. Gupta's writings have focused on arms production and weapons proliferation, South Asia and Australian security policy. I recommend that you read his article, The United States Policy Towards China, Challenge, Compete, Cooperate, available online through the NICE website. Thank you for being here, Dr. Gupta. We are ready to hear from you.
You can unmute yourself, yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. This is what happens when you're not very good with technology. All right, listen, thank you. I have some slides, so I'm going to put them up. If you can just let me do a screen share here. There we go. And current slide. Okay. All right. Can you all see this? No. Okay.
Dr. Gupta, may I suggest that you can skip
Yeah, I've
the
got
slides?
it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there we go. Now I've got it. All right. Look, let me just start firstly saying thank you to Pramod for setting this up. And I'm going to start from the beginning here. I'm building on what Peter Trubowitz said and Ambassador Prakash said. And the thing to remember about Biden's foreign policy is it is a movement away from Trump. In some ways, it's a continuation in other ways. Trump was charismatic, Trump was unilateral. He was also not for foreign intervention. He did call for did assassinate Qasem Soleimani, but we didn't get into another war in the Middle East. Also, he correctly focused on China while both Obama and Bush had talked about it, but continued to be dragged back into the Middle East. Now, as I see it, this is really about three things. It's about the challenge of dealing with China and Russia and lesser players. It's about competing with China, and it's about cooperating with China. The challenge is very clear. The United States obviously is worried about losing its #1 status in the international system, which it has had for close to 30 years now. So the way this is being done is primarily by talking in terms of restricting China's role in Asia. And that is about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, freedom of navigation in the East China Seas, so on. The competition's the more interesting one. Because yes, if you talk to the Chinese, they say very clearly, if there's a war in the South China Sea, we lose. But can the Americans sustain their presence there for 60 to 70 years? And we all know the answer to that is no. The more interesting part is the competition part. And the competition part has become on creating alternative global economic orders. And right now, the key to that is 5G. You know, Huawei was 2 to 5 years ahead, depending on what you were looking at, in technology of 5G. The United States has caught up rapidly, and it has managed to shut out Huawei from large chunks of Europe. Germany, Huawei's footprint has been reduced. In Britain, it has been taken out. And I would argue that he who wins the 5G battle wins global technological domination. And this is where countries like India, as I pointed out yesterday, play a key role because it's 1.35 billion people. If the Indians go with American 5G, the battle is over. And this, to my mind, is the great leverage India should be using in its discussions both with China and the United States. The other interesting one is the competition for new energy vehicles. And this is where Biden has been quite different from Donald Trump. He is pushing green energy. And Tesla is this overpriced and quite frankly, overrated car. but go and see what is happening with new energy vehicles in China. Li, Xpeng, you can go down the list on it. NIO, they are really putting money into new energy. They're also putting money into batteries. And whoever wins the new energy vehicle challenge is going to have a massive global footprint because the world is ready for electric cars. Now, what is more interesting to me, though, is while the Biden administration talks of competing with China, there really is no big vision for having an alternative economic plan to what the Chinese have come up with. The Chinese have come up with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is really ASEAN, but it doesn't work without China. And they've come up with the Belt and Road Initiative. Where is the alternative? Now at the G7, there was talk about we're going to do a green belt and all this kind of stuff. There's no money for it. And do keep this in mind. I love the Europeans dearly. I call them the world's largest or the world's oldest open air museum. And believe me, I'm not being nice when I say that. But the fact of the matter is, with the devastation of COVID, where is the money going to come from to do military operations in the Indo-Pacific or to build an alternative economic order? And this is where, is this America's problem or is this a Western problem? It's something which we should talk about. And, here's the data on China. And I'm using the EU Trade Directorate data. This idea that Trump had that somehow the US was going to play hardball with the Chinese. China's #1 trading partner now is ASEAN. China's #2 trading partner is the European Union. China's #3 is US. China's #4 is Japan. The Chinese have created a solid Asian trading bloc, which is dynamic, which is technologically advanced, which is futuristic. And I keep writing about this. Why is the United States and the West not providing an alternative to this? Where is the American alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative? And Facebook and McDonald's don't do it. Let's be clear about that. The other thing to note, if you look at all these countries, and leave out Hong Kong, which is a money laundering operation for the Chinese, but if you see every other country on that list, they're all either American allies or American well-wishers. So what you're really talking about is getting countries to hedge between the United States and China. And they're doing this pretty effectively. So what is America's challenge? And I think of it differently. I work for people who talk about international security issues in terms of hard power, but I think we have to talk in terms of providing an alternative vision of world affairs. And that really has to be on trade. It has to be on global health, because the one thing which came out of the pandemic is Trump's idea of unilateralism doesn't work. The pandemic means globalization is back with a bang, because to effectively spread vaccines, you need international cooperation. And by the way, again, there's a lot of talk about Chinese vaccines, but the Chinese have done a very good job on vaccinating their own people. And they're the ones who've given the vaccines to the Indonesians, the Malaysians, the Chinese, the Filipinos, the Argentinians. And why are these countries able to do large amounts of vaccination? Take a look at that. I also raised this issue. If you want to do an alternative order, Europe and Japan have to help the US by coming up with money. And I'm not sure whether that can happen. Which then brings up the issue, do you bring up new alliances? And I'll say very briefly, if you want to deter China in the Indo-Pacific, countries like France, Britain, Australia, it's a waste of time. You need countries which have military capability. And really only 2 countries fall in there, apart from Japan. Japan has substantial military capability. Those 2 countries are India and Vietnam. Everybody else you can forget. So the Japanese, the Indians, the Vietnamese. And let me bring up Peter Trubowitz's point by showing some data, because I think this is the key one. As you can see, in the last election, Biden won 477 counties, Trump won 2,497 counties. Biden won 81 million votes, Trump won 74 million votes. But the last one's the important piece
Dr.
of data.
Gupta, your time is over. Would you please?
Right, so let me finish one sentence and we're
Yeah, please.
Biden's counties had 70% of American GDP. Trump's had 29%, comma. Therefore, how do you bring about equity in the American economy? And honestly, that is going to be a challenge, which I don't think the Biden foreign policy can address. Thank you, and sorry for running over time.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for highlighting the issue that we have not touched upon earlier. The whole issue of vaccine and finance for Indo-Pacific strategy and new global economic order. This was really helpful. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Xiaoyu, Associate Professor with the Department of Political Science at the University of Nevada, Reno. He's a public intellectual program fellow with the National Committee on United States-China Relations and non-resident senior fellow with the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. He has also had the prestigious honor of being postdoctoral fellow in the Princeton, Harvard, China, and the World Program at Princeton University. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. So my talk will focus on Biden's foreign policy on China. Especially, I want to compare sort of perspectives from both sides, from Washington and also from Beijing's perspective. What are some of the challenges, problems going forward in a bilateral relationship? So I would first briefly talk about the shift from Trump to Biden, and then talk about the enduring problems, tensions in the bilateral relationship. And in the end, briefly talk about going forward, my sort of brief prediction going forward. What are some of the challenges in a relationship? First, from Beijing's perspective, actually compare Biden with Trump, some of the geopolitical thinker in China, they actually prefer to deal with Trump rather than deal with Biden. I mean, the conventional wisdom, we might think, oh, Trump was so confrontational, right? So such a tough policy, or maybe at least tough rhetoric on China. But why some people in Beijing, they want to deal with Trump? Because Trump is was confrontational without being really competitive. Trump's policy largely damaged more of American prestige and reputation rather than damage China's. So if you were like a real geopolitical thinker, you want to deal with that kind of leaders rather than Biden. So in that sense, but of course, no matter who is in charge in Beijing, they cannot decide who become U.S. president. So then Biden's approach regarding China is much more sort of comprehensive, emphasize the competitive elements, but also have a much deeper, more comprehensive rethinking of U.S. position on the global stage. So then I move to the second point I want to make is, what are some of the enduring problems or challenges in a bilateral relationship? So Biden's approach recognize the relationship with China is gotta be very competitive, but also recognize the relationship is multidimensional, is more complex. As some previous speakers mentioned, there are elements both sides will compete. There are elements maybe they could or should cooperate. So have a more nuanced understanding of the so-called China challenge to the United States. But there are some enduring sources of tension in the relationship. So some scholars conceptualize as so-called two orders problem in the bilateral relationship. From Beijing's perspective, the key challenge of the United States is not necessarily about international order. It's more about Beijing worry America's intervention or challenge of Communist parties of China's leadership in China's domestic order. But Washington or America's concerns is China might challenge America-led international order. So this is the challenge is the two visions of different orders. Beijing concerned about domestic order, and the United States concerned about international order. So then we see, because of these enduring sources of tension, we see the relationship has become securitized to some degree, in a sense that previously political tensions were largely separated from economic, technological, or educational exchanges between the two countries. But because of the enduring problems, we see there are some sort of spillover effects of the rising tensions for the bilateral relationship. And on the other hand, we see there are some sort of rethinking on both sides. Previously, interdependence was largely viewed as being positive. Interdependence, especially economic interdependence, could promote peace and cooperation between the two countries. But now both sides see interdependence as a sources of vulnerability, right? So we see this kind of concept, weaponized interdependence. So both sides are rethinking the strategies. They try to reduce vulnerability. So reduce dependency on each other, on the other side. So the Trump administration already implement some sanctions, some new policy, the trade war, and to some degree, Biden administration continue. And on Beijing side, they have some new thinking. They have some new concept called the dual circulation, emphasize both domestic market and international market. They realize only rely upon international market will be too fragile for China's policymakers. So there are some sort of readjustment on both sides because of the enduring tensions. Finally, let me have a brief word about the relationship going forward. There is no illusion that the relationship will be very competitive. The real issue is how to manage the risk. But ultimately, for both sides, the key components of competitiveness is domestic reforms on both sides. So whether either the United States or China, they could pursue necessary domestic reforms to have more sustainable economic growth. So that's the key, not confrontation against each other. So I think the key competition is which side could pursue necessary reforms going forward. And finally, I want to say is that the best case scenario for the relationship is how to avoid the catastrophe, like a new Cold War scenario or a complete decoupling between the two sides. The key is how to manage the tensions, how to manage the risk while pursue some sort of domestic reforms on both sides. Thank you. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. You are able to bring a different perspective, a balanced approach, understanding concern of both party, and also both confrontational and competing approach dealing with the conflict. Thank you very much. This is very helpful. Now I would like to welcome Professor David Lublin to share his thought with us. Dr. Lublin serves as chair at the Department of Government in the School of Public Affairs at the American University. He has received National Science Foundation grants and a fellowship with the German Marshall Fund. His most recent book, Minority Rules, Electoral Systems, Decentralization, and Ethno-Regional Parties, was published by Oxford University Press and won the Best Book Award with the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the AFSA. Dr. Lublin, please let us hear from you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. And I must say it's an honor to be introduced by a former ambassador to my country, and hope you're not missing Washington too much, particularly at this time of year when the weather is so lovely. I also want to thank Dr. Jaswal for putting together such a fine conference with so many panels, including this one. I agree with much of, I think, what's been said already, so I'll do my best to keep my remarks within time. I think what's interesting about the Biden administration's foreign policy is a couple of things. First, like with many presidents, much of it is going to be driven by domestic concerns. And the polarization within the United States makes it increasingly viewed as imperative for each party to win the elections. And so President Biden is acutely focused on his constituencies. And I think it's interesting that on certain issues, as I think several have mentioned, he's continued with the policies of the previous administration. Most notably on trade, he has not lifted the tariffs, which present the problem of looking like they benefit only the few, even though in fact they're raising prices of goods substantially on the many. But we all notice the jobs lost, rather than the dishwasher prices are now all $30 higher or whatever they are. And thus a lot of focus there. He's continuing also the policy which, despite the previous administration's hate for the Obama administration, was actually a continuation of their policy, which is one I would call of conserving American treasure and arm power, okay, which is trying to reduce our involvement in conflicts precisely so that we can preserve and project our power more strongly, because when you have so much invested in fighting a war or a conflict, it weakens your ability to act elsewhere and thus makes you more vulnerable elsewhere. It also, I think the American people seem to have less of a taste for this, perhaps than in the past. Another continuity, I would say, is somewhat with China, in that, has been noted, the People's Republic is now seen to be treated more openly as an adversary rather than as sort of a partner for engagement. Okay, which strikes me as, even though the relationship was always competitive, I don't think it was as openly adversarial in the Obama administration as in the Biden administration. I think some of this stems from the Biden administration's determination to compete on values as well as economically, and that China, in order to, China seemingly has become sort of more trumpeting of its system, but more notably also its actions in Hong Kong, while really not of interest to the previous administration, which had no interest in sort of liberties in other countries and questionable interest in liberties in this country, and indeed seemingly wanted to suppress them. You know, that sort of suppression is deeply bothersome to people who support liberty and democracy, and including the Biden administration. It's interesting, no one's mentioned the issue of Taiwan yet between the United States and China, and that remains a similar, I think in many ways, you know, a much larger problem, because both Taiwan projects, liberal democracy and economic success, while the current Chinese government bases its support not just on economic success, but also on nationalism. And I might caution a bit on assuming that the inevitable rise of China, which seems likely to continue based on its population size, will necessarily continue on such a smooth trajectory. It's already facing problems of an acutely aging population, and the corruption within its system also continues to cause problems for China. I would just caution people, I remember back in the 1980s when Japan was going to surpass the United States as an economic power. And obviously Japan is quite successful and China has done an amazing job of expanding its people, but just as I think the current anti-liberal trend within the United States was not anticipated, other things may be anticipatable but not anticipated. I guess I would sort of say, finally, in terms of what's interesting about the Biden's projection of democracy is not so much that it's new, but that it's welcome. Okay. I would note that many countries in the past have found, rather unsurprisingly, the United States' projection of these values at times overbearing and annoying. At this point, I think it's more welcome, but as previous people have noted, also suspected as impermanent and with real justification. So we will see. This projection of democracy also has implications for our relations with other countries. It means that the Biden administration tends to be much more suspicious of sort of populist right-wing governments. I might note that the sort of rating of democracy has gone down in the United States. It's also gone down in India, where Freedom House has now rated as a partly free instead of a free country for the first time. But the reality is, I think India remains an electoral democracy and one we want to engage with. The US will hopefully continue to bolster sort of fragile democratic regimes in Southeast Asia, precisely because I think it views as democracies more likely to be our friends. I think at that point, I should just conclude because I don't really want to duplicate the other speakers too much, who I think frankly have much more expertise on foreign policy than me. I look forward to hearing from the questioners and very much enjoyed hearing all of everyone else's much more thoughtful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lublin, for bringing the American citizen perspective to us, to our region. You have enlightened us on the issue of Biden administration foreign policy. Now, we would like to invite Dr. Asuka Matsumoto. Dr. Matsumoto is assistant professor at the Department of Policy Studies at DoshishaUniversity. Please take the time to read her article, The Biden Administration's Foreign Policy Toward Asia, Among Multilateralism and Middle-Class Diplomacy. It is an enlightening read. Dr. Matsumoto specializes in US political diplomacy and international politics. Please share your thought with us, Dr. Matsumoto.
Thank you so much, Ambassador and Dr. Janu, as well. I'd like to share my PowerPoint. Can you see my PowerPoint? Okay. So especially I'd like to concentrate on difficulties between multilateralism and middle-class diplomacy. As Ambassador kindly introduced. Okay, so I'd like to wrap up this recent work So especially the Biden administration foreign policy toward Asia, and also the rejoining international institutions, comparing the especially comparative analysis on the Trump and Biden administration. As many speakers mentioned, priority of the Biden administration is domestic issue. And so after COVID-19 economic relief, climate change, racial equality, civil rights, and the immigration system, after that, the American foreign policy came. And of course, the President Biden mentioned America is back. And like recently, the US rejoined many international institutions. The first rejoined in WHO, the COVAX, and the second, the rejoined Paris Accord, climate change, and the third partially rejoined, kind of trying to reform the WTO, but still they're keeping like a trade conflict. And fourth, partially they're trying to continue kind of partially in the Pacific initiatives. And fifth, newly they're trying to promote or introduce the kind of infrastructure investment and human rights democratic diplomacy. So questions and key points are here. Why is there gradation of rejoining the international institutions, and what is the impact? What is the impact on Asia? Here are three factors. Probably the first, kind of unified government, so they're going to more left. And factor two is winning issues. So of course, the main issue is COVAX and the COVID-19. And thirdly, the kind of especially by the administration is trying to focus on white working class after the Trump administration. So-called, also some speakers already mentioned, so foreign policy for the middle class. So like Jake Sullivan, especially focused on this phase. And before the presidential elections, already a couple of think tanks, the US think tanks, researched the white working class. However, so as like white working class in Midwest tends to support mild intervention by international assistance. But of course, there is kind of a small question. The definition of middle class, it's very difficult to define. Probably that's not core Trump supporters in Midwest, actually, but white service workers, including urban essential workers, suburban white moms, and probably retired elder white people due to COVID-19. So here, to analyze these points, I'd like to compare a couple of international institutions and also touching upon Asian policy. The first three, as for COVID-19 and WHO, COVAX, so especially the Biden administration is trying to connect COVAX, vaccine diplomacy with Indo-Pacific initiatives also. And the US is trying to return to WHO as the biggest donation country again. And also probably they're trying to get not only Asian support, but also like African support by vaccine diplomacy. It's very relating with international institutions and voting, how to say, the kind of top of the international institution is really depending on African countries also. And the second point is the Paris Accord and climate change. That was symbolic achievement between the US and China under the Obama administration. However, the Biden administration is careful on compromise due to alliance management. As we know, like, for example, Alaska diplomatic talks of US-China is a little different from the previous by Obama administration. And as for third, WTO reform and trade conflict, so still there is sanction 301 and 25% tariff on most Chinese goods. But so already like Japan are okay. Or also Canada and Mexico reformed their kind of trade agreement partially. So probably still Chinese part remains, and probably also the U.S. criticism on WTO is focusing on special privilege for developing countries. So that talk was not only Trump administration, but also from the Obama administration, and still the Biden administration is discussing the same thing. So we are okay. Taiwan, Brazil, Singapore accepted, but still like China and India are trying to keep the privilege of developing country. So that probably that's a kind of core issue on WTO reform. And as the fourth reason, the Indo-Pacific strategy. So they made the new position for Indo-Pacific strategy, the so-called coordinator for the Indo-Pacific in NSC. But however, someone also mentioned like US. This is kind of a US people Asia without TPP, so without economic trade agreement. But however, they are trying to add the vaccine diplomacy or digital supply chain and the democratic partnership. So I am not sure, but and also they are trying to keep amount of defense budget. But however, the kind of quality or equipment seems a little different due to according to budget plan. So it seems a little, it has changed a little bit. And the fifth, President Biden and the G7 leaders launched Build Back Better World Partnership recently. And this is a kind of affirmative initiative for meeting the tremendous infrastructure needs of low middle income countries. So this is really a little matching the middle class diplomacy, as I mentioned. And probably this idea is a kind of a counter project of One Belt, One Road. So of course still there is no like RCEP or TPP, but they are trying to disperse, I guess. And as for Human Rights and Democracy Alliance, so someone mentioned, so actually President Trump is not really interested in human rights or like democratic alliance really. However, Republican Party itself is trying to support the kind of partial sanctions based on the new U.S. law to protect human rights and democracy. But since 2020, so that's a new issue. Actually, that was yes. So not only Democratic Party but also Republican Party is supporting these issues. And as for Biden, the President Biden mentioned the democracy summit. However, of course, it seems very difficult. Okay, so last part. Okay, so the conclusion, the kind of the Biden administration foreign policy towards Asia is between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and adding the promoting vaccine diplomacy, human rights, democratic cooperation, and the world infrastructure investment. Of course, there are still obstacles, but thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Matsumoto. You have covered everything that we wanted to really hear at this moment from Biden admin, foreign policy towards Asia, COVID, Build Back Better, climate change, aid, trade, and development. Thank you very much. This was very helpful. And now our last speaker is Dr. Anders Servin. He is Executive President and the Regional Coordinator of Economic and Social Research, CRISE, which is an independent, non-partisan Latin American and Caribbean regional think tank. Anders Servin is an anthropologist who holds a doctorate degree in political science. Last but not least, please lend your insight to us, Dr. Servin.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Karki. And well, it's very difficult to be the last presenter on such a distinguished panel. But there is an advantage. I have the time to reorganize my presentation, so to complement a little bit what has been already said. So let me tweet some ideas because I don't have time in 8 minutes to develop them. First of all, I think that for understanding how the Biden's administration new policy, foreign policy, particularly foreign policy, is going to move, we have to take into account the changes of the international system and to understand that this is the background of what is going to happen in terms not only of the Trump's policy, but also on the Biden policy. I'm not going through all the changes because this is a long list and there is a lot of debate on that, but within this context of a changing international system, what I would like to emphasize is that maybe, and this is a difference with what Professor Trubowitz mentioned, maybe we should change a little bit the order of the priorities of the Biden administration, taking into account what is happening in the US and in the world as such. I think the first priority for Biden is to solve the domestic problems, and the rest, the foreign policy, is subordinated to this. A coherent foreign policy is crucial, mostly to solve the situation of the middle class in the United States, to improve the economy, and of course to confront the impact of the pandemic. So in this regard, I would say that, however, we have to take into account that Biden is prioritizing also its foreign policy, but something that impacts us in Latin America is that there is also an emphasis on democracy and human rights as values that should be restored in the international system. And from this point of view, taking into account these three priorities, the domestic priority, the foreign policy, trying to reestablish the alliances and the links with formal allies to conform a bloc, particularly regarding the relationship with China, and thirdly, the need of building up on this for, sorry, let me come back to this, to prioritize democracy and human rights as a value. I would say that there are three big challenges for the Biden administration. First of all, America is stuck in its domestic problems, which reduce Biden's ability to maneuver internationally. And this is something that is going to be present all over for the next 4 years during this administration. And I would add to that, that maybe there is the possibility of restoring the alliances and rebuilding Western Bloc regarding what is happening in the world, but at the same time, restoring the alliances in terms of what is happening now is a very short-term response, because the allies are thinking, well, what's going to happen in 4 years? Is this going to have any continuity? Now, the second challenge, at the same time, America is forced to address the fact that the allies of the US have already started to decoupling their own interests from those of the United States. That was during the Trump administration, but it's still going on. And I just mentioned one example of this. After the Biden's tour to Europe, there was the expectation that Europe is also going to start a sort of dialogue with Russia. And there are serious difficulties to build a consensus in the European Union to go ahead with this dialogue. France and Germany are putting pressure on this, but most of the Baltic and Poland and other Eastern countries are against this. So it's not going to be easy to reestablish the way of working with allies as before the Trump administration. And third, and most important, is as Xi Jinping China is convinced that its time has come, Asia Pacific will be the priority and the backbone of the US diplomatic efforts, particularly through the free and open Indo-Pacific initiative. And of course, the focus of foreign policy will be on what's going on in Asia Pacific. Now, once I said that, I would add that there is, of course, a big difference between how they are going to address the changes on the international system from the perspective of the new Biden administration or from the perspective of China. Much has been already said about what is going to happen in terms of competition between the two nations. But I would like to add that maybe China has some advantages in terms of promoting some very coherent and consistent initiatives in the field of trade, investment, infrastructure, and of course the Belt and Road Initiative is an example of that. And oppose this initiative with values is going to be very difficult to contribute to build something as a bloc on the side of the Western countries. However, I would add that the Western bloc is already a work in progress, the restoration of the Western bloc. And on the other side, I don't see that China is building a bloc in the same terms as the Western bloc with allies on her side. China is more an individual actor regarding what is going to happen in the international system. And as I think I have still 3 minutes, let me move to how we see all this in Latin America. And of course, the US-China strategic competition is affecting us. We had been neglected in the region for the last 20 years by the United States. Whatever United States was trying to initiate regarding Latin America, it was related to the more hot, I would say, issues like migration. And that means that mostly it was focused on Mexico and Central America. Latin America in general is of systemic irrelevance in the international system. We are very peripheric, and but at the same time, we're becoming of strategic relevance because of the competition between the United States and China. China had made inroads and had a lot of influence and increased its influence during the last 20 years in Latin America. And of course, is using the vacuums that the United States left in the region. But it's not only the...
Time is over. Will you please conclude?
Thank you. Last sentence. It's not only the bipolarity between China and the United States, but it's also the presence of other actors that make us think about a multipolar system. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre Sarven. You have talked about trade, immigration, and also issue related to democracy and human rights, emphasizing the domestic problem of the United States. Now I would like to open the floor for questions and discussion.
Ambassador Karki, I have a quick question and a quick comment. Can I?
Please, I would like to allow panelists, if you have any question to other fellow panelists, please, you take this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. One quick comment to Mr. Andre is about the allies that China has or is not into the business of making allies. From my perspective, it is difficult for China to get allies other than Pakistan and North Korea. I don't think that there is anybody willing to aligning with China. My perspective, I could be wrong. Secondly, about Taiwan, and this is a question more to my American colleagues. You know, we all know that Chinese aggressive posture towards Taiwan is increasing by the day. 25 to or 26 fighter jets and air assets are deployed to intimidate Taiwan. There is belief that in the next 4 to 6 years, force could be applied. Granted, and that strategic experts believe that it will be an overwhelming assault, so that when the US comes in or others come in, there's a fait accompli presented. My question is that given the kind of overwhelming force application that is being anticipated, and there is no permanent presence of the US in South China Sea, is it possible, feasible for the US to do something in that, in a situation like that? And will the US have the capability, desire to actually deploy forces to repel or contain the Chinese aggression? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Your question was to Andres, right?
Well, to
yes.
Dr. Peter and, you know, I mean, the...
Yes, let's start from Peter. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Can I make a quick
you can
answer?
start. Okay, please.
Yeah. Regarding China's allies, I agree with you. I think that from the Western perspective, sometimes they're looking at the bloc between China and Russia, and China and Russia, even if they have some strategic convergence, are not allies in the same terms as they are posed in the Western bloc. So I agree with you completely that there are few allies around China that can contribute to building a bloc. Thanks.
Okay. Peter?
Yes. So let me respond to the question about Taiwan. It's a very good question. And frankly, I think you'll get competing views about whether or not China could launch a preemptive attack before the US got its act together. You have a fait accompli. I mean, I think the larger point here is both sides are playing with fire when it comes to Taiwan. The Chinese need to be, Xi Jinping needs to be careful in the sense that if he moved, it would be very difficult for an American president not to react. But this goes even more so in the reverse case. I think this is like, you know, like the third rail of politics in a sense inside China. And so I think a lot of this kind of pushing and these forays of flights and so forth is a show of strength, but in part it's defensive because of moves that the Trump administration made and the Biden administration, where they have kind of reintroduced, recommitted themselves to Taiwan in a way that was I think it was, you know, kind of left more ambiguous and ambivalent in the past. And so I think that this is just, if you had to pick a hot point and a place where things could go south very quickly, I think that's, you know, I would single that particular, I mean, there's a number of them. There's Korea, North Korea, but I think the situation in Taiwan is especially tense. And I think now also just the last point on this, and maybe, you know, Amit would want to speak to this. I think because of the clear vulnerability now with semiconductors that's kind of come into focus, that it kind of raises the stakes for everybody in that region. So this is not a clear answer to your question. I hear different views on whether or not China could pull off a preemptive strike, but I think kind of at a political level, I would just underscore for both sides, this is very risky business.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any other fellow panelists would like to ask question to
let me just very quickly, and then I'll let Professor Poo talk. Look, the American military is preparing to fight a war in the South and East China Sea. We all know that. 2, any such war would lead to a global economic meltdown. And the Chinese are fully aware of this. 3, what is Taiwan's commitment to defend itself? Because when the Chinese in the 1990s fired missiles over Taiwan, 30% of Taiwan ran away to Sydney, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle. That's the rich part of Taiwan. And I'll end by saying this, the Chinese repeatedly say this, if we fight the Americans, we lose. But can the Americans sit for 60 to 70 years in the South and East China Sea? And you have to look at the last part in it, because contrary to popular belief, nobody was willing to sit in Afghanistan for 60 to 70 years. And you cannot do nation building, you cannot create security architectures unless you sit somewhere. The US is still in Korea, the US is still in Japan. Ask Professor Matsumoto why it's still in Japan. The US is still in NATO, in Europe. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me a very quick sort of comment about the Taiwan issues. So I think war is not in everyone's interest in the region and for the whole world. The classical sort of definition of war is the continuation of politics. So fundamentally, for Beijing, Taipei, and Washington, it must handle the political dispute carefully. So in a sense that, I mean, the dispute over Taiwan is not entirely a military issue. It's not even in China's interest, in Beijing's interest, to use military against Taiwan. So the key issue is how to handle the dispute, political dispute, peacefully. So the United States has a relative successful story. It's called strategic ambiguity. It has worked for so many decades. So the key formula is, on the one hand, deter Beijing from using military force, but also reassure Beijing that there will be a peaceful approach going forward. So the United States does not support formal independence of Taiwan. So I think the most dangerous scenario is that Beijing is overconfident about its military capability, but over pessimistic about the peaceful solution of the dispute. I think the United States should continue, on the one hand, maintain some kind of deterrence, but on the other hand, it's very important to reassure that US has this kind of China policy framework will still be valid. The Biden administration should still respect that kind of framework. So I hope, I think cooler heads will win over from all sides.
Thank you very much. I don't see hands from other fellow panelists. I would like to encourage participants to ask questions to our distinguished panelists. Is there anyone who wants to ask question? I don't see any hand, but I have two general questions from our two friends. Karki Gupta wants to ask a general question. And it says that it has been more than 5 months since the Biden administration has assumed power. He hasn't called a single ASEAN leader so far. More so, his interim national security strategy guidance document confers equal importance to Indo-Pacific and Europe. This may send mixed signal on US leadership, particularly to Southeast Asian nations. Are the US expectation in the Indo-Pacific region limited to Quad? What about greater involvement with the Southeast, greater involvement with the Southeast Asian nation? This is the question from Kartikeya. Would anyone like to answer Kartikeya's question?
Can I take a stab at it?
Please.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador. I cannot speak for the US, but generally speaking, any leader, and 5 months is a very small period in any society.
Yeah.
And that too, when you're talking of a nation like the US, which has just gone through an election which was not the smoothest in its history, with the kind of situation that obtains in terms of COVID, in terms of societal issues. So you have to start somewhere. I mean, theoretically, if he had started with ASEAN, then the Europeans could have said the same thing. But I would think, as a former diplomat who has put in some 40 years, that the amount of diplomatic initiatives that he has packed in and his experienced team in a period of 5 months is remarkable. I have rarely seen so much of activity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. There is another question in chat room by Dr. Surendra Rawal. And he says that would greater power competition be the core and permanent feature of the United States foreign policy for the foreseeable, or is it just transitional? Will there be a room for more meaningful cooperation with China within the great power competition? This is the question.
Mr. Andre has a comment, and Professor Fu has a comment.
Okay. Andres, please.
Yes, in fact, I have a comment and a reaction to another question. So maybe we can wait for my answer. It's about Russia and China.
Okay, Dr. Fu, you want to address this question?
Yeah, I think the great power competition, I think it looks like a much longer sort of framework guiding U.S. foreign policy going forward. I don't think it will. I mean, it proposed during the Trump administration. Now it continues. I don't think it will change anytime soon. I think the key issue is how to sort of manage great power competition. It's not like this concept will disappear. I think there are two issues here. One is exactly as the question refer, how to, on the one hand, compete with China, but also promote some meaningful cooperation. I think Biden administration, at least in terms of foreign policy framework, in the very beginning, emphasized cooperation with China is very important, like dealing with climate change, dealing with regional challenges like North Korea. So I think they will try, definitely. I think the second component is, I think there is a tendency in the United States to play this so-called China card domestically. So emphasize using China as sort of tool to consolidate domestic sort of support to pursue necessary reforms, to pursue the costly project like infrastructure building and other projects. But the danger is how politicians could play the China card appropriately. So if competition with China could help American people have more infrastructure, that's all good. But competition with China shifted all the resources to military building, to defense, to war preparation. It would be a distraction for all the necessary reforms in American societies. I think the second component is also a very important.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Fu. I have two Facebook questions here.
Actually, could I just jump in on the last question first, briefly?
Please.
I think I know, people have made analogies to the Cold War, but I think a key difference between our relations with China and with the Soviet Union is that the Soviet Union was simply not integrated into the international economic system in the way that China is. And that China is a big economic power, as is the United States, and has, you know, deep interests related to maintaining those connections, as does the United States, in a way that that the Soviet Union simply didn't, due to its very different economic system. And so that ultimately serves as somewhat of a moderating force on both countries. I mean, it serves as a point of leverage, but but if you overplay it, you may hurt yourself too much as well. Notwithstanding Dr. Gupta's point that the United States is not the primary trading partner of the People's Republic. It's still an important one, and the US's control over the US dollar and various other international levers also give it some weight.
Thank you.
Ambassador Karki, Professor Trubowitz has a comment. I'm just assisting you since that's about all I'm doing, not making any recommendations. But
I have a comment, but I saw that Asuka's hand was up as well, so why don't I let her go?
Okay.
Well, I'd like to go to the floor question. Is it okay?
Yeah, please.
Can I? Okay. So someone asked a question: how do I assess B3W, Build Back Better World by G7 amid the global power transition? So of course, it must be important to provide selection option for recipient countries. And for now, the G7 countries are trying to provide $40 trillion by 2035. So the amount very huge, but also US has already the Biden administration is already try to increase the amount of USAID. So maybe a little, partially it's possible, but also, and it must be better for like transparency or anti-corruption, or some probably some recipient country had a trouble with China due to like territorial issues due to like the deficit problem. And but of course the G7 countries, the opinions of G7 countries are not unified. Like some countries are not really that doesn't have enough budget, and also for example Japanese ADB is partially cooperating with the Chinese, the AIIB, but so they are not really unified, but still I think it's it has kind of impact. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. We have one more Facebook question, and I want to share this with the panelists. And they say that, is it viable for the United States to tackle with China and Russia both at the same time? Who would like to answer this question?
Dr. Amit Gupta and Mr. Andres, both have raised hands.
Okay. Look,
Amit.
I'm going to put this.
Go ahead, Dr. Gupta.
I'm going to put this as, I'm sorry, Andres, if you want.
No,
please.
go ahead, go ahead.
No.
Okay, sorry, my apologies. Look.
No, go ahead, please.
You know, I've been writing on demography, race, and world order for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the line, Washington has to stop thinking in terms of the white nations determining world order. You know, and I can see Ambassador Prakash is laughing. It's that world order has gone. That world order is not relevant. Britain and France are not global powers. The Australians can't fight in the South China Sea. New Zealand has 4.5 million people, 2.5 million taxpayers. I work at Maxwell Air Force Base. We have more aircraft on our airfield than the entire New Zealand Air Force. Okay, so leave all these people and start talking. And by the way, you know, to add to Dr. Matsumoto's point, where is all this money going to come from the Europe? Somebody, you know, ultimately speaking, I love big talk, but the rubber has to hit the road. And I'm not a Trump supporter, I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, but Trump was right about Europe. These guys can't pay their bills. So if this is the reality, the United States has three choices: do the Middle East, do Russia, do China. And the Middle East is out now. Trump managed to get you to have peace treaties between all kinds of Arab countries and Israel. Russia, Trump tried to minimize. Even Biden had a fairly productive meeting with Putin. And Andres can talk more about this. Other people can talk more about this. Which leaves China. And, you know, listen to Kishore Mehbubani. I know the Singaporeans are a small country and they're dark-skinned, so why bother to listen to them? But sometimes dark-skinned people have relevant points to make. He keeps saying, take 1 out of 3. You can't challenge all 3. And Bush tried this, Obama tried this, Trump tried this, Biden's got it now, finally. It's going to be the United States and China, but I will say this to all of you. We are going to have to accommodate China in a multipolar world, right? And nobody is writing about this. It's all about force on force, Taiwan, South China Sea, Senkaku, Daiju, who cares? The reality is world order is changing. And I'll say this to David Lublin, you know, just because you work with young people at American University, I work with middle-aged people. So there's a difference here. I wrote an article on this. I want all of you to know this. 70% of millennials said, we will not fight under any circumstances. 20% said under some circumstances. 10% were like the usual idiots in a survey. I don't know. So if 70% are saying we will not go to war, what are you going to fight with? 50-year-olds? Let us look at reality. You have to plan for multipolarity. And nobody wants to admit that. And again, I'll go back to Mehbubani. Mehbubani says everybody in Washington knows it's coming. Nobody in Washington has the courage to say it's coming. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Andres.
Yes, thank you. Well, let me say first of all that I subscribe Amit's approach to what represents a Western way of looking at the rest of the world. And secondly, the point on multipolarity. I'm afraid that there is a sort of absorption by a way of looking of how the world is going to, the new world order is going to emerge through this axis between the United States, the competition between the United States and China. It seems that everything is bipolarity. And my impression is, and I agree completely, that we're living in a world at this point of the transition between a bipolar point of view and a multipolar point of view. And there are other actors in the system that we have to pay attention to. And in this regard, I would say that focusing on the question, you cannot put in the same bag China and Russia. And in my opinion, it was a very wise move by Biden to have this meeting with Putin. I'm not going to talk about human rights and repression and whatever. I'm just going to talk about how the West should try to deal with the new and different actors in this multipolar world. One is the competition with China, and the other thing is to try maybe to on one side to divide this alliance or this convergence between China and Russia, and on the other side to attract again Russia to a closer link with the West, which is difficult after Ukraine in 2014. But however, I see some signs, positive signs both on the side of the Russian, both by the Biden administration, but even by some European actors who are going to be key in this regard. And a final point about this is that maybe we should look, when we are talking about a multipolar world, how not to take sides in the confrontation between the United States and China, and how to try to maintain some sort of non-alignment or strategic autonomy, if you want to call it, in the European concept or whatever, that allows us to play with different and many actors and not necessarily take sides in this confrontation.
Okay, Anders, thank you very much. Is there any other comment, question?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in since I was mentioned. I very much agree with Dr. Gupta that it looks much more like a multipolar world in the future. The United States certainly is not generally acting in a way to preserve its advantage, which would be declining anyway for the most part, or at least has not been over the past 20 years particularly. I also agree very much with the previous speaker about regarding sort of the focus on a US-China competition. Frankly, to a large extent, the entire thing puzzles me in that it's not in either country's particular interest. I think, as someone said earlier, I think lots of rhetoric is in both countries' internal political interests in terms of political advantage at home. In terms of, I thought Dr. Gupta's comments on the US military are very provocative and interesting. I guess I'd point out, and yet we still have a military filled with millennials, and that it seems to continue to exist and be a rather good one. The other thing I'd point out is, the statistics he points out can be viewed as a good thing or a bad thing, in that Americans don't want to fight in any war regardless, which is probably a good thing. On the other hand, not wanting to fight at all full stop reminds me eerily perhaps of France in 1939, which is perhaps not a good thing. However, the most disturbing implication may be that precisely because of the statistics he cites, that the US military, which has never been truly representative of the full US population, is going to be an even more sort of subset politically of the population, and what would be the domestic implications of that, which I think both of us would probably agree would not be positive.
Ambassador Karki, can I take 1 minute?
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. You are very gracious. I would broadly agree with what Dr. Amit Gupta has said, and certainly he intended to be provocative, which he has done successfully, so compliments. I have just one comment to make about multilateralism. We are all for multilateralism, but multilateralism means that everybody goes by the book, plays by the same set of rules. For the last 40 years, the Western world in particular, and everybody have engaged with China to promote multilateralism. And what has happened? Any organization, be it WTO, be it WHO, be it the UN, there is stalemate, there is a problem. So if one nation takes advantage of open societies and doesn't play by the book, I don't know whether multilateralism can succeed. Thank you.
Can I jump in, Ambassador?
Please.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff on the table here, or I guess on the platform. It's provocative and interesting. I would make 3 points that kind of speak to different previous comments. The first is just simply, since a lot of numbers get thrown out there, to remember that the advanced industrialized countries account for about 60% of world GDP. They're not quite done. So I think that's, the real issue among the advanced industrialized countries, given that they have a fire in the rear, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, is whether or not they can actually coordinate their foreign policies at this point in time. given populism across, a lot of the OECD. But that brings me to the second point, which was the question about Build Back Better and the G7. And while I think one can say that, that was more rhetoric than it was concrete, upfront cash, I think the way it really should be viewed is probably the first attempt by the G7 and advanced industrialized economies to actually come up with a coordinated strategy that serves not only the purpose of a kind of common denominator among them, but fundamentally and importantly, squares with their needs domestically. That's the great challenge, is to be able to coordinate what they try to do internationally with what they do domestically. And just on this last point about domestic politics, so I've written about playing the China card. It's an old diplomatic and political move inside the United States that goes back to the 19th century. It's been played a number of times. But I think the important thing to mention here is this is a problem not just on the US side, it is very much also on the Chinese side. Not that China will play the China card, but that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership will play the American card. And the great danger, I think, going forward, and this is where Taiwan gets wrapped up and so forth, is that the domestic politics on both sides feed one another. That lowest common denominator politics on the American side singles out China. And the same thing happens on the other side. In the Chinese case, if Chinese growth stalls, I can't remember who it was that said it. I think maybe it was David. We don't know what's going to happen in China, and we sure as hell don't know. And were Chinese growth to really slow, the party leadership is going to have to find something else to keep everybody in line.
Ambassador,
Dr. Gupta.
Okay, very quickly. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, I'll give you an optimistic view of multilateralism. After the Indians and the Bangladeshis signed their maritime agreement on the boundary, ASEAN took that to the Chinese and said, look, the Indians and the Bangladeshis did it. Why can't we? Here is a template. So, multilateralism has some very positive aspects to it. Long way to go. I don't disagree with you. That's one. Two, I would say this to David. David, yes, we're full of millennials. Most of them are not in the fighting arms. And here's what you should look at. Largely, the fighting arm of the American military is Caucasian, except in the Marine Corps. Largely, it's Caucasian. Everybody else goes into the services side of the military. And this is the military's dirty secret. I would say this, the American military can beat any military in the world. The American military doesn't want to sit and occupy a country. That leads to complications. Okay? And the third point, which is Peter Trubowitz's point, look, Peter, you said it in the beginning, and I think you ended up with the same argument. Yeah, it's 60% of global GDP. It's shrinking rapidly. Japan is going from 7% of global GDP to 4%, because Japan is going from 126 million people to 107 million people. Same thing's happening to Europe. But the core point here is what you're saying. Look, the British turned out to have a lousy COVID policy. There is this demand for putting money in the National Health Service. The Italians said, it's like Y2K. We couldn't deal with Y2K, forget about it. We can't deal with COVID, forget about it. That's not state policy. Yeah. You're going to have to put money into healthcare. The Swedes put no money into healthcare. So, and you know this, so
that may be where the strategy for the advanced industrialized country, and not just lies. What I'm saying, I think we agree. I think we're at a kind of inflection point where countries are groping right now for that strategy.
I want to say one last thing, and then I'm not going to talk again because I'm hogging the conversation.
Okay, Dr. Gupta. Yeah, please.
I want all of you to remember 2044, or two things happen. 8 states in America have 50% of the population, and it isn't going to be Alabama. You figure that. Okay. 2, 2044, 50.4% of Americans are non-white. 49.6% of Americans are white. How will that change our foreign policy? And I will leave that, and just remember, again, Europe is doing, we're worried about the Muslims. Yeah, you do your usual post-imperial rubbish. We are going to be the evolving country, and watch how we set world affairs on that optimistic note.
Dr. Gupta, thank you. Is there anyone who had not responded wants to make a concluding remarks? No one. So I think this is a right time to conclude this session. I would like to thank all of you for your very generous support and also valuable contribution. I am not going to summarize the discussion that we had there, but it is impossible to do that, such a rich discussion. But I would like to really extend my deep appreciation to all of you for your participation, engagement, and contribution to this discussion. Similarly, I would also like to thank Xiaoyu and also NICE for bringing us together and allowing us to initiate the discussion and debate among ourselves, and also addressing some of the challenging questions raised by our distinguished participant. Thank you very much. Let's conclude this meeting here. Over to you, Pramod Xiaoyu.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good sharing.
Distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the chair for agreeing to. Distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we express gratitude and thanks to the chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.